In today's clip, Piers Morgan is going to be talking about how they want countries like Saudi Arabia to go in a particular direction. And Jordan Peterson is going to respond by saying, if they don't, well, you can hear for yourself.
We should be encouraging these countries, like Saudi and the others, to continue on the path they've been going, because ultimately that's where we would like them to go, right?
Well, the alternative is war, right? I mean, that's the alternative, and war of the worst kind.
So, to be fair, there is a lot that I could assume about this conversation, but Islam teaches us to be honest, to be truthful. So I'm not going to put words in their mouths, but rather I'm going to point out that this is some very dangerous rhetoric that's unclear. What direction exactly does Piers Morgan want countries like Saudi Arabia to go in? And why exactly is the alternative war of the worst kind, as Jordan Peterson stated? I think that's really important to express. I mean, you're talking about war of the worst kind if Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia don't move in the direction that Piers Morgan is referring to. What exactly are you guys referring to? And why is war of the worst kind the only alternative? Now, since they were so unspecific, I'm left to sort of try to figure this out for myself. Now, granted, I could be wrong, but there's only two things that come to mind. Number one has to do with supporting Israel. Because the way that I see it, all of the major conflicts in that region that involve the United States are all tied to Israel in one way or another. And when Jordan Peterson tweets, "Give him hell, Netanyahu, enough is enough," which is then followed by what many people today have labeled a genocide of the Palestinian people, it raises the question, is this the war of the worst kind that Jordan Peterson sees as an alternative? If countries like Saudi Arabia don't go down the path that people like him and Piers Morgan want them to? The only second thing that really comes to mind is this bigoted labeling of Muslims, of Arabs, as psychopathic fundamentalists, which they seem to be doing in this interview, and they have been doing over the past few weeks. So I guess if you're going to label Muslims, and specifically Muslims from these countries, as psychopathic fundamentalists, then that's probably the easiest way for you to garner support for war of the worst kind, because we've seen this happen before. You demonize Muslims, you use your large media platforms to exploit certain events, and use the fear of the citizens to attack the Muslims and the Muslim countries that you have demonized.
I mean, the UAE sheikh said directly that, and implicitly, that it's up to the West to distinguish between psychopathic fundamentalists manipulating religion for their own sadistic and hedonistic ends, and the moderate, typical Muslim immigrant that you're speaking of. Well, we don't, because we're so damn cowardly. We accept the hypothesis that the Muslim community is in some sense monolithic. We don't separate the psychopathic fundamentalists. We don't separate the wheat from the chaff. And then we leave the moderate Muslims in some ways at the mercy of the absolute psychopathic fundamentalists. And we whitewash that as a kind of liberal progressiveness.
Yeah, so this is interesting because Jordan Peterson is acting like the problem is that everyone views Muslims as these peaceful people. You know, after all these years, decades of propaganda portraying Muslims as these peace-loving people, now there's this crisis because there's actually psychopathic fundamentalists among them, and we don't differentiate. Which is absolutely the complete opposite of what's happened. Muslims for decades have all been labeled as these psychopathic fundamentalists. And we as a community have had to fight an uphill battle expressing that, no, we're not psychopathic fundamentalists. You have to separate us from some of these crimes and events that happen and are used to paint all Muslims with one brush as psychopaths. Now just think about this whole conversation is coming about because of what? Because of the UK grooming gangs. You want to talk about separating the wheat from the chaff. Let's talk about these grooming gangs. Number one, there is nothing at all whatsoever Islamic about these grooming gang crimes. So why don't you separate those crimes from Islam? Secondly, how do you even know these people are Muslim? Just because they might come from a Muslim country or maybe even a Muslim family doesn't mean that they're Muslim. Doesn't mean that they're practicing Islam. And all of the evidence regarding these crimes suggests that they weren't Muslim, or they definitely weren't following Islam. The only Islamic thing about this story is that a Muslim born of Pakistani immigrant parents played a vital role in getting the criminals arrested. But it doesn't end there, because then you have the hypocrisy of the situation. Because statistics show that a victim is 30 times more likely to be abused by a white man than a brown man. So why don't you talk about how cowardly people are being for, instead of talking about that and focusing on that, to instead demonize the brown man? And then just like you assume that the brown man, because he's from Pakistan, he's following Islam, assume that the white man is doing these things because of Christianity. And then put out this huge media campaign talking about psychopathic fundamentalist Christians running rampant with these awful pedophile rings. Grooming of the type that you guys are talking about, as awful as it is 3% of child sexual abuse. 97% of it is not localized grooming. And this is why we're making these sorts of videos, because clearly these people have an agenda. There are countless different issues that they could focus on, and there are countless different ways that you can spin an issue. But when people like this use their huge platforms to clearly, dishonestly demonize Muslims and brown people, Arab countries, etc., and throwing around threatening phrases like war of the worst kind, this is very concerning. And people need to be aware of it, because it's the viewers and the audience that are being manipulated. And they are the ones that can be manipulated to be sent to war of the worst kinds due to people's dishonest agendas. And this is something that we've seen in recent history, and I pray to Allah that we don't see it again. Allah knows best. Thank you for watching. May Allah protect and guide all of us. Subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdik ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.